Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Stephanie Reads. Today, we are going to be talking about Pachinko. There we go. Pachinko, which is by Min Jin Lee. Min Jin Lee. This is, I just want to point out, I know it's enormous looking, but I got the large print edition from my library. So this one is like 750 pages long. Yeah, 745. According to Goodreads at least, the standard print edition is 496. So it is still definitely a long book, but I didn't want this to scare you away. So I actually had to go to Goodreads, or no, sorry, not Goodreads, Novelist, to figure out what genre they classified this as, because honestly I wasn't really sure, because this is so different than anything I've ever personally read before. I mean, I know this is like a thing. This is not a completely unique style of book, but this is different than anything I read. They classify this as a family saga and a historical fiction book, which I would agree with. I just never thought of family saga as being like a genre before. And while this takes place throughout history and there is definitely a lot of history involved, I don't think that's necessarily the focus of the book. So I would put historical fiction secondary to family saga, which is how they had it listed as well. So that's just why I didn't immediately think, yeah, this is definitely a historical fiction. So the gist of this book is it follows several generations of this Korean family through, the book starts in 1911 and ends in 1989. So for almost a century. And it starts in Korea right after Japan takes over, invades and occupies Korea. And then eventually the book moves to Japan. And the time frame, you get a lot of context with like World War I, and then World War II, and then the Korean War. And then once you get past that, there's not really any, like, the historical part of the book completely drops off. It's not, I mean, you get chapters will begin with what month and year it is, but there's not really, like, the historical context doesn't come into play at all. So again, historical fiction definitely takes a backseat to a family saga. And so you follow this Korean family through several generations and 78 years, if I did my math right. So the purpose of this book was to follow this family. And the historical context gives a lot of, or the historical aspect gives a lot of context for the specific things that they're going through and the trials that they're having, basically. The pacing on this is really, really dense. This is a dense book. There's no getting around it. In fact, I started it a few times, and I mean, part of it was this kind of book is really not my thing, but another part of it is it was just a little on the dense side for me. So I ended up having to switch to the audiobook, and then I was able to get through it. But it is very densely written. There's a lot of prose and a lot of description. So the characters and the plot is their life through these 78 years. And so the characters are slowly developed, because the development that you're getting in this book is not specifically like your standard kind of character development. It's literally watching them grow up and then have children, and their children grow up, and how they interact with their children as adults and that sort of a thing. So the plot is very leisurely and unhurried. I wrote leisurely paced and unhurried, and those are perfect words to describe it. There's a fairly straightforward plot line for the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book, it kind of shatters, and you, instead of following like specifically this one family, you're getting a lot of other characters and stuff, and it's told from the third person perspective. but you're still getting like chapters from this person's point of view. So it's a lot more scattered, the second half. So that does break it up, but it also confuses stuff to a certain extent, because there were times where I was like, who's this person? Because you're going to have 2 chapters on someone that's been mentioned like once. And not speaking Korean, or Japanese, I really had a hard time keeping everyone straight because they were all unfamiliar names for me. So that was kind of a chore a little bit. But depending on what you're looking for, having more points of view and, you know, it getting broken up a little bit more might actually be a benefit depending on, you know, what your preference is. I will warn you, the book has an open end. So when books have a like definitive end point, they're not open-ended. I mean, I guess closed-ended would be the term, but I don't think that's actually a term. So when books have a specific like end point, they tend to be more, have a little bit of a faster pace. I mean, not specifically they're going to be fast paced, but they have a little bit more of a specific pace because they have to get to some sort of finishing point where everything's tied off. When they're open-ended, they don't have that rush to get everything tied off before the book ends. So this being an open-ended book makes an environment for a more leisurely pace. The characterization of this book is phenomenal. I mean, that is where this book really shines. The focus in the first half of the book is really on just a handful of characters, like the core, you know, family unit. And then the second half, like I said, it splits off and you're getting a bunch of side characters. So the characterization for the first half of the book is much richer than the second half. You're getting some characters that have like 2 or 3 chapters about them, and then you never see them again. So it's hard to kind of describe the character development in this book because I almost felt like this was 2 different books. And so the first half, you get this unbelievably amazing character development. You get super detailed, super vivid characters, very well developed. And then the second half, it'll like skip ahead 5 or 10 years, and then it'll come back to somebody, and a bunch of stuff has changed, but there's not a lot of like context or background on like what exactly happened. It's just like, well, here's how they are now. And so it's hard for me to say how the character development is in this book because, like I said, it's so divided. So it was really, I don't even know what to say other than kind of just describe it for you and let you make your own conclusion. Even the characters who are only in it for a couple of chapters are written in a way that you are supposed to kind of be able to put yourself in their place and understand where they're coming from. And that is a big part of this whole book. I think well, I'll get to it later. I'm getting ahead of myself. But you have many really well-developed, dramatic, vivid characters. And then you have some, I guess, side characters that I personally felt kind of detracted from the story, but they're not as well fleshed out. And their stories aren't necessarily finished. Yeah, it was kind of a weird thing. You would have this character who has literally only been mentioned once because she married another character that's just like a very small secondary character. And then all of a sudden you have 2 chapters about her. And some stuff happens and isn't really resolved. And then you never hear about her again. Or her husband. He's like mentioned briefly later, if I remember correctly, and that's it. So it's not even like her story was there to give context for his story later on when he's back in the book. It was really weird. I don't know what the point of that was, but again, I guess it just depends on what you're looking for, because if you're wanting a book that gives a bunch of different perspectives, that talks about a bunch of different stuff, that gives you kind of tiny little glimpses into different aspects of life in Japan in like the 60s or whenever this was, there you go. Yeah. The storyline is all about people. And this is definitely a character-driven book, for sure. Character-driven. The author's intention, so one of the questions that I get asked, not by people, but that is on my list of questions to ask about a book when I'm writing notes, is what was the author's intention when writing the story? And I've literally never answered that question, because I'm like, how am I supposed to know? Well, this book, I actually feel like I have an answer for that. And I think the point of this book, cheers. The point of this book was really to raise awareness, really isn't the right word, but give people a historical context for the plight of Koreans through time. And which sounds really weird, but I mean, like, I had no idea, to show my own ignorance, I had no idea that Japan occupied Korea before World War I. I had no idea that Korea was ever occupied by Japan, ever. And I didn't know that back then Korea was just one country. Like, my whole life it's been North Korea and South Korea, and I'd never given any thought to how that happened. So that plays a huge role in the lives of these characters. So imagine, if you will, that you're an African American and the Civil War happened, in your lifetime or your parents' lifetime. And you are now free in the North, but no one outside of America has any idea that any of this ever happened. That there was slavery, that this war happened, that ravaged the country, and that your family has had to endure all of this stuff and overcome to become free. Nobody knows, except for Americans who lived through it. So I feel like this is kind of on par, where the Koreans kind of go through a similar thing where, they weren't to the point where they were in slavery, but it was not a healthy relationship that Korea had with Japan during the occupation. Again, my only historical context, my only knowledge comes from this book, so historians, please don't come at me. So I think the author's purpose in writing this was to teach Korea's history and be proud of her people and what they've overcome. Which is fair, because I was super impressed with the stuff that had happened and how I had never known any of it. So I think that kind of plays into why there's so much of an emphasis on the historical context and how that greatly impacted this family for the first half of the book. But once the Korean War is over and things have kind of leveled off, the historical context is just completely forgotten. Which I feel like was a shame, because that was, I think, my favorite part of the book. So it's just something to keep in mind if you are going at this book for the historical context and you really want the historical novel. The first half of the book is great. The second half of the book, there's no point in reading if that's the only thing you're going for. I wrote the storyline. I have a ton of adjectives for it, but domestic. I've never had a chance to write that before, but the story is domestic. and complex and unbelievably tragic. This is not an uplifting story. This is a story that will make you sit down and like after you're done reading, you're going to be like, I literally texted my friend who recommended this book to me once I finished, and I was like, well, that was brutal, and now I need some chocolate. And she was like, yes, and wine. Lots of wine. And it's true. I mean, you don't come away from this book with like happy feelings. There's no warm fuzzies in this one. Sorry. I kept reading thinking, okay, at some point the family's gonna be, they're gonna get to a point where like everything is okay and people are happy and they can accept who they are and everything. And then the book ended and it never happened. And I was like, holy moly. So to warn you, there are, from the description of this book that I have given, and also the description of the book that's on Goodreads and on the flap of this book, you would never know that there are some fairly racy scenes. I mean, we're not talking like full-blown erotica, but I was like, oh my, reading it, and I had no idea that those were coming up because it just kind of happens out of nowhere. And there are like 4 or 5 times in the book where I was like, I am uncomfortable. So I just want to warn you because there is literally no warning. Like you have no reason to expect that at all. Also, like I said, the book follows a bunch of different characters, and given or depending on who they're following, like which perspective they're following at that point, the tone completely changes, and some of the people use really intense foul language. It's not a staple throughout the book, but there are definitely some scenes in the book where there hasn't been swearing for 700 pages, and then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, oh my. So again, totally unexpected. And so if that's not something you want, it's not that big of a deal because it's only a handful of, it's like 2 or 3 characters in the whole book, and they're not main characters. So I just want to warn you, especially if you're listening to it on audiobook, like not safe for children, basically. So for the frame and the tone, the frame is this incredibly detailed background of Korea during the early 1900s, and then Japan somewhere, they moved to Japan somewhere in like the 20s or 30s. And then you have Japan during World War II and the Korean War, and then all the way through the 80s. And the frame really affects the tone and the atmosphere because you have a country who is occupied by kind of a hostile government, basically. And then you have the occupiers losing a war and kind of taking it out on the Korean citizens that are now in Japan. And so it gives you this tone of just despair, bleak, hopeless despair. Like I said, this is not a book for people prone to sadness. This is a book for those who like to live through the nitty-gritty, horrible things that others have endured, basically. I did not particularly enjoy this book. I really enjoyed the first half where it's just the core family and you have this unbelievable historical setting. The second half was very scattered, and I personally didn't enjoy that. I also listened to this on audiobook, which didn't help because you'll get to the end of a section and then all of a sudden the author just gives a month and a year, and you have no idea how much time has passed since the last time, because you can go like 45 minutes or an hour in the audiobook without there being like a date stamp. And then all of a sudden you get a date stamp and you're like, I can't remember where we were for the last section. And if you're on an audiobook, you can't just like flip back to see what it said. And the time jumps were super random in the amount of time that they covered. In fact, there was one at the end where I thought they gave 1989 like 3 times. And on the 3rd time, I finally was like, wait, haven't we been in 1889 or 1889, 1989? And so I was really confused because I thought more time was passing than actually was, but it was like 2 months later. It was just in the same year. So I found that really hard to follow. And then there just wasn't a lot of follow through with stuff. Like some big thing would happen and then the end of the scene would happen. And then instead of like there being any fallout from that scene, it'd be like 7 years later. And you're like, okay, so what? Yeah, I mean, like at one point, one of the characters is dying and his son is like, I don't want to go to school because I'm afraid, like I have such a limited time to be with my dad. And his dad was like, school's super important. I'll be here when you get home. Go to school. And the scene ends with him reluctantly getting his backpack and going to school. And then you turn the page and it's like 5 years later. And you're like, wait, did he die? Did he not? And they like halfway through the next chapter, they're like, oh yeah, and then so-and-so had died several years ago. And you're like, oh, apparently he died. But you don't get to grieve with the family. You don't get to, I felt like that was really jarring because this was someone who you had like rooted for a long time. And then all of a sudden they're like just gone and everyone else has already moved on and like life has gone on. And that sort of thing happens quite a few times in the book. And I was like, for a book that's all about character development in the life of these people, that's a really weird choice. So, and then once you got to the second half of the book, it just didn't really even feel like it was about the family anymore. It was, I couldn't actually figure out what the point of the book was anymore. They just started talking about all these random people without any follow through. And the people didn't even like have any interaction with the family a lot of times. And I spent the whole book trying to figure out like what the culmination of this was going to be, like how things were going to like wrap up for this family, how they were going to actually like improve their lot in life. And then the book just ends and you're like, what? So and again, this is not my sort of a book. So I don't want to dissuade someone who really wants to read this because like the whole point of me doing these breakdowns is for you to be able to actually decide if this is something you want to read or not. And I hesitate to even give my own opinion, but I did have requests for people to kind of hear my thoughts on the book. So my personal thought was, first of all, I need some sort of redeeming, uplifting quality. Otherwise, I feel like reading is just a chore, and there was none of that in this book. There is literally no redeeming overall, like, hey, they went through all of this stuff, but it was worth it because they made it through to the other side, and here's how life got better. Like, it just doesn't. So for me, I don't like that. I don't enjoy, and I'm like this with movies too, and my husband kind of laughs at me because watching movies about like people's misery is kind of his thing. And I'm like, I can't handle it. I don't want to walk away feeling gross. And that's how I feel when it's this sort of thing. So yeah, overall, it was not my sort of thing. So I feel I can't give an unbiased review of how the book was because I didn't like it purely because of what it was. Now, I did have these issues with the writing that I've already mentioned. So I can mention that and you can from there make your own decision. I do feel like the first half of the book was amazing. And I kind of wish that the author had just ended it there. And I read after I finished, I was like, am I crazy about the book feeling like two separate books. So I kind of went on Goodreads to see what other people had to say, and there were quite a few reviews that were like, listen, when it comes to the second half, you can just stop reading. And if I had done that, if somebody had handed me the book and had cut the second half off and it just wasn't there and said, listen, there's not a more satisfying end farther down the book, so there's no point in reading further on, I would have been completely happy. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So the audiobook was okay. She wasn't my favorite narrator, but being a white person who does not speak Japanese or Korean, I did find it super helpful because it was hard to read some of the stuff because there's a lot of words in here that are sprinkled in that are either Korean or Japanese. And I don't speak either of those. So the narrator, I don't know if she actually spoke them, but she sure sounded like she knew what she was doing when she pronounced the words. So I found that really helpful, that I didn't have to stumble across or like stumble through those. I did see some people wishing there had been some sort of like glossary or something for the terms in other languages. And I felt like I was able to get stuff from context, but again, I was doing it through an audiobook with a narrator who was able to give the word like emphasis and inflection and that sort of a thing. And I think that really, really helped. So if you are someone who does not speak Korean or Japanese or both, I mean, you might find it helpful to do the audiobook just for that. And like I said, she did a fine job. There just wasn't anything to like write a home about. There have been so many audiobooks that have like blown my mind, and this just wasn't one of them. She did a fine job, but not a fantastic job, if that makes sense. So that was Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe before you leave. And until next time, happy reading. Let's do something else. The frame and the tone, this incredible... Oh my. Not speak either of these languages.